Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Grayzone. It's been a while. It's been another long week. As always, a lot to discuss, and we'll get right into it with Aaron Mate. Aaron, how's it going?
How's it going, Max? Hey, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Please like the stream and share it. And thank you for being here.
Yeah. Trump is the first president to do anything illegal in U.S. history. That was the big news of the week. As neocon liberal darling Jennifer Rubin said on MSNBC today, he is a convict and therefore a loser. Because if you're convicted of a crime, according to the Democrats, you're a loser. The same party that wants, and I agree with them on this, that thinks felons should be allowed to vote if they're free and they've done their time. But anyway, this is kind of the talking point from the Democratic side. The Republicans and Trump specifically have raised over $70 million since Donald Trump was convicted of a felony. And we'll get into some more numbers in a minute. But Aaron, what are your thoughts on Trump's criminal conviction on 34 counts of hush money to a former porn star?
Well, I did not follow the case for not even a second because I couldn't bring myself to care about another Trump courtroom saga, which has been sort of the theme ever since he got elected. Rather than respond to Trump's, fake populism by embracing actual populism, Democrats have done everything they can to undermine him extrajudicially. First via the Russiagate scam, framing him as a Russian agent, and on and on to the first impeachment when they tried to get him for pausing weapons to Ukraine while pressuring its government to investigate Joe Biden and help out with the Russiagate, with an inquiry into the Russiagate investigation, and onwards. And this is the latest iteration of that. Legal analysts who know the law more than I do say that this case was a complete fraud. Even if you want to get him possibly for a misdemeanor, there's no way that could have been a felony, especially since the 34 counts were just replicated the same charge multiple times. And it's obvious what this was. This is just a way to get Trump off the ballot and be able to say that he's a convicted felon, as now Democrats like Adam Schiff are doing now on repeat. And one irony of this case is, the allegation is that he's accused of falsifying his own business records to mask an election expense in the form of a payment to Stormy Daniels, because Trump had an affair with her. So therefore, paying
allegedly. He denies the affair, and I don't know if the case proved the affair, but he probably did it. But
well, that's a funny thing. Is he even though obviously it would probably help his defense to at least admit it, he still couldn't admit to it because whatever, he doesn't want to admit to having an affair. So that probably hurt his case in court. But who cares? But so that's the claim, right? And like whether that's a felony or not, what did the Clinton campaign do when they were trying to cover up their payments to Fusion GPS to produce the Steele dossier, which was far more consequential, whatever you think of it, than Trump's hush money payments to Stormy Daniels? They classified the research for the Steele dossier as legal services, which it was not. That was a campaign expense to manufacture dirt, which happened to be far more consequential than Trump paying off someone who he had an affair with, because at least Trump paying off Stormy Daniels, that actually happened. In the case of Christopher Steele, the Clinton campaign paid Steele to manufacture a deranged conspiracy theory, which then engulfed Trump's entire campaign and arguably worsened relations between the U.S. and Russia and fueled the Ukraine crisis that we're in right now. So that was massively consequential. So even by their own standards, the Clinton campaign did something, I think, exponentially worse in terms of their concealment of their campaign payments. But of course, there's no accountability for that. Instead, Trump gets indicted on the one area where, like obviously Trump has been really encouraging of the carceral state of mass criminalization. He cheered on the Central Park 5 scam and called for them to be executed. So maybe people like that are feeling some justice seeing him get prosecuted, but otherwise, I just think this was a complete scam.
Well, this is America where we hold the powerful to account when they committed high crimes. Obviously, that's sarcastic. This was the dumbest trial, one of the dumbest trials I've ever seen. It was obviously politically motivated. I don't know how you deny it when Alvin Bragg, the DA, ran on his desire to convict Trump of something. To what extent was this tied to the Russiagate investigation? Like, they failed to get Trump on anything Russia related, on anything relating to collusion with Vladimir Putin. We were told constantly the walls were closing in. You were joking about it day after day. And Michael Cohen was sort of a central figure in all of this. And Michael Cohen was essentially turned on Donald Trump and is doing like a round of interviews on MSNBC and elsewhere. So
And has made a ton of money off of this too.
yeah.
I mean,
Well,
this has
well,
kept him
tell
in the
us about that.
spotlight. Like, this has kept him in the spotlight for like an 8th consecutive year. Like, why are we still talking about 2016, Michael Cohen, all these useless characters? It's because Democrats cannot acknowledge the humiliation that of Trump's victory, which did not result from Russia or from him paying off Stormy Daniels or even James Comey. It resulted from them being a corrupt, warmongering neoliberal party, and Trump successfully exploited the animus towards that. And rather than do any reflection on their failure, we've all been engulfed in Democrats' like never-ending crusade to make this all about Trump and to get him by any means necessary. And so I think this trial was the latest manifestation of that.
Definitely. And it seems to be all they've got until the election. So it's what the Democrats will use. And having watched a lot of coverage over the last few days on CNN and MSNBC, you hear them constantly hit the talking points that Trump's a felon. How can the Republicans defend a felon? They're defending a felon and attacking the justice system. But they never talk about the crime itself or the damage it did to the public. And I think that's the problem, is that the crime, whatever the crime was, is just obviously exaggerated, and people are seeing through it, and no one trusts the justice system, especially people at the bottom of the U.S. economic totem pole, who have been screwed over by the justice system for my entire life. Why should people believe in the justice system? Why should we be above criticizing or attacking judges when the judge determined that the jury didn't even have to be unanimous on this decision? I mean, they bent the rules so much to get this conviction, and a lot of people had the same thing happen to them who don't have Donald Trump's wealth and power. But I think the bigger picture is Donald Trump did far worse things than a bookkeeping error to Stormy Daniels. The killing of Qasem Soleimani, to me, while he was on his way to a peace conference with Saudi Arabia, kind of ranks up there. And you look at the way like mainstream media framed the whole thing as though this was like this historic conviction of a president, and it shows the evolution of the justice system and that we're becoming a more equitable and democratic society. I mean, this is the AP Afternoon Wire. Trump becomes first former U.S. president convicted of felony crimes. I mean, let's just think about that for a second. He's the first former U.S. president convicted of a felony. What have the last presidents done? I mean, these are deranged criminals walking our streets free. George W. Bush, Dick Cheney wasn't even president. Why is he a free man? Why is his daughter a hero of the Democratic Party? He owned stock in Halliburton, had a financial stake in one of the major contractors in the Iraq War. He falsified intelligence in order to sell the war. He outed a CIA agent, Valerie Plame, to punish her husband for exposing that there was no yellow cake in Niger. In other words, that Iraq had no WMD and that there was no mushroom cloud that could later be a smoking gun that could later be a mushroom cloud. Dick Cheney lied to the American public to turn a profit and got 1 million Iraqis killed. And he's kind of become like a resistance hero, along with his daughter, who like co-wrote articles with him for the Neocon Weekly Standard run by Bill Kristol, has become one of the big financiers and operatives of the Democratic Party. The Obama administration, all the drone assassinations, killing American citizens with drones. We could go on and on, but the point is, American exceptionalism is truly an amazing thing here. And the gentleman's agreement is still in effect, except for Trump, because Trump angered those very same elements that the other presidents were serving when they committed titanic war crimes.
Yes, and this conviction only helps serve Trump's fictional narrative of him being like a populist. Like, he successfully tapped into populist anger because there is no political force that can actually organize it with substance. And of course, he talked about draining the swamp. He appointed a cabinet full of billionaires. His major achievement was passing a tax cut for the ultra wealthy. But Democrats don't want to run against him on that because they're just allergic to actual working class politics. They just are. They serve the same donors. So they have to come up with these completely devious and also disconnected ways of challenging that no one cares about. And this conviction, I think, will only serve Trump's narrative, his fake narrative of being, persecuted by the deep state. And I mean, there is truth to that, actually, because the deep state has gone after him. But in terms of him being a threat to the establishment, this will serve that narrative because this is such a ridiculous conviction. The only people it will serve, are the same constituency that have given us Russiagate and all of its various sequels, is MSNBC anchors and CNN anchors and pundits in that liberal sphere. No one else cares. No one else cares. I think if anything politically, this will only help Trump at a time he's already doing pretty well against one of the worst presidents, if not the worst president in history, Joe Biden.
Yeah, excellent point. And nothing illustrates it better than how Donald Trump was received at UFC last night. It was not surprising at all. The only thing surprising to me was that Poirier went 5 rounds, got into the 5th round against Makhachev. His takedown defense was surprising. Donald Trump being hailed as a gigantic hero at UFC, explicitly because he is being persecuted. He is the pseudo-populist working man's hero. And Democrats don't even know what UFC is. A lot of them don't. The people who watch MSNBC, they don't even know what it is. It's one of the most powerful cultural forces, not just in the US, but across the world. And it brings people together and provides a really open forum that you don't see in any other sport, where actually Muslim fighters can get up and call for an end to the slaughter in Gaza, can even make supportive statements for the Palestinian factions in Gaza, while people in the crowd chant USA, opposing them in the ring. But let's just watch Donald Trump enter UFC last night.
Also with us.
Trump is probably asking Rogan to let him come on his show.
Well, and he will. I mean, why not?
Well, Rogan's actually turned him down before, I think, funnily enough. But let me show. Can I just show my contrast?
One thing, Aaron, but it's just 15 seconds. I mean, okay. Trump was celebrated explicitly for being persecuted by the U.S. justice system in the middle of the ring by Sean Strickland, who fought a fairly boring 5-rounder against Paulo Costa, who's a friend of Bolsonaro, actually. He's a Brazilian fighter. And Sean Strickland is one of the most popular UFC fighters. And so listen to what he's saying. Kevin Holland, after scoring a 1st-round takedown, this is a black fighter. He jumped out of the ring and immediately rushed to Trump to shake his hand. Every fighter ran to Trump to salute him. You even had Khabib, one of the most famous fighters, who is the coach of Islam Makhachev, speak to Trump. Trump said, "You're my favorite fighter of all time," and he said, "You have to end the war against Palestine." This is someone who also represents Russia. Him and Makhachev and all the Dagestani fighters, who are the top fighters, top grapplers, they represent Russia. This was broadcast in Russia. It's something that's happening below the surface. U.S. media doesn't like the dweebs in U.S. media don't follow this at all. But this is, You know, these are guys going to this arena that's packed to the gills who are going into debt to pay for these expensive tickets. And when they see Trump, they see someone who's identifies with them on some cultural level, who's being screwed by the system. They feel screwed. And no president in their lifetime has materially changed their conditions. So what does it matter to them if Trump's a Republican who's giving these fat tax cuts to the rich, or Biden, and Biden's doing the Inflation Reduction Act or whatever he's doing? They just want someone they can kind of identify with. And that's Trump. And I mean, I think that says it all to me about this conviction. Actually, Strickland went on during a post-fight press conference and said he admired Trump because Trump got to hang out with models. So,
and meanwhile, like, this is what Democrats are basically offering voters right now. This is like just a representative clip from MSNBC. This is former Mueller prosecutor Andrew Weissman.
With, as you've noted, with respect to Judge Marchand, I mean, I am like, now you have like a man crush on him. He is such a great judge that it's hard to see that the jurors wouldn't have the same impression. I mean, you just keep on thinking, if you looked in a dictionary for like judicial temperament, that's what you get.
So, okay. So basically, like, that's what we're supposed to be excited about if you're a Democrat right now. It's like, another patrician hero like Robert Mueller and William Taylor, remember the former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, who was, now it's this judge in the case who Andrew Weissman has a man crush on. And like, who is going to relate to that beyond elite people who really care about like legalese to like to an extreme? I mean, or like diehard liberals. Beyond that, this will not appeal to anybody. And the tragedy, of course, is that Trump, who is he actually going to serve? Well, he just got a $100 million donation from the wife of the late Sheldon Adelson, the like billionaire casino magnate, who's now given him $100 million to a super PAC. Why? Because she feels as if he will be even more hawkish when it comes to backing Israel. So,
and again, by this point, he's almost raked in $100 million because of this conviction.
But what I'm saying is, like, that's who Trump is actually going to serve, is people like Miriam Adelson, not the people who are cheering for him at the UFC.
No, that's the next point. And people are like, oh, like the UFC, it's so cringe or whatever. Like, stop. Like, why are we looking at? That's what American elections are. And they're saying UFC is shallow and dumb in the chat. That's what US elections are. That's pretty much all they are. It's just one marketing ploy after another. So I think it's significant. And I think you're right, Aaron, that yes, Trump is going to exploit the fascination and admiration that all these guys have for him to serve the deep state and to serve Israel. And this conviction makes him need those elements more than he ever did before. Remember in 2016, Donald Trump in the first debate said, I donated to all the candidates on this stage. And I donated to Hillary Clinton too, because I know how the system works and I want them to do what I want. And that's what makes me independent, is I have a fortune and you don't. So I don't need to serve all these millionaires like you do. Now Donald Trump is serving the millionaires. He needs them more than ever. He needs Israel more than ever. He needs Nikki Haley, who he basically dispatched Vivek Ramaswamy to dehumanize her. And it was delicious to watch. But he's going to need all those neocons, and his administration will be filled with them. And the Miriam Adelson support for Trump is, I think, one of the most significant harbingers of what a second Trump term will look like. Here she's funding a colossal super PAC for Trump.
$100 million. It's like, it's staggering. It's so much money. And, you would have thought that after Trump's first term and all the advisors of his who threw him under the bus, including Nikki Haley, that, maybe there's like, it'd be plausible to think for a second that, well, maybe there'll be no neocons left for him to appoint, right? And like, he'll move on from his neocon phase, which was his first term in office, appointing people like John Bolton and Mike Pompeo, the worst neocons in the world. But the thing is, the neocons just never go away, and they always find a way to adapt and to glom onto anything that can serve their agenda, and they're doing the same thing now. They're all sucking up to Trump. Nikki Haley has endorsed him, so they'll all be there. They'll all be there. They will all be there again, except for John Bolton. Basically, he's the only one who's isolated himself from that circle.
Bill Ackman to back Donald Trump. This is the guy who's trying to destroy all the university presidents and take over universities on behalf of Israel because they won't illegalize Palestine solidarity demonstrations. And, you know, I highly doubt Bill Ackman agrees with the Christian right on issues like abortion. His wife made special orbs. His Israeli pseudo artist wife made special orbs as gifts to Jeffrey Epstein in exchange for donations to a center she worked for at MIT.
Yeah.
I mean, they're not just sleazy, but they represent Israel.
As Mike Tracy, I think, said, Bill Ackman also does not want to drain the swamp.
No, I mean, this is the swamp. And, you know, Nikki Haley, I mean, what is she? Former Boeing board member. She represented the swamp creatures. Like in Washington's suburbs, you would see like Nikki Haley for president signs on mansions. And that was probably like the only place you would see it in America. And here she is writing, "Finish them," on a 155 millimeter Israeli tank shell. America loves Israel, as always. Nikki Haley. This is one of the shells. I mean, there are no tanks in Gaza. We reported from Nasser Hospital in Khan Yunis on one of these shells being fired into a recovery room, blowing the head off of a 14-year-old girl named Dunya Abu Mohsen, whose entire family had been killed in an airstrike. She had lost her leg and she was recovering and had just given an interview about how she wanted to learn to become a doctor, train to become a doctor, and help other people who are going to have to wear prostheses because there were so many amputees in Gaza as the result of Israel's deliberate targeting of civilians. And this is what Nikki Haley's done on her latest trip to Israel after announcing that she was going to support Trump. And I've seen people say, I don't know if it's true, that these shells behind her, to the left of her head with her little like flak vest on as if she's going to be shelled, are white phosphorus shells.
Oh.
But this is, you know, these are the people that will be in Trump's stead. And it's obvious that I think a lot of this is being engineered to cripple whatever was left of Trump's independence and control him if they can't jail him and prevent him from running.
Yes, and there's more cases to come, but I think this was the only case that will be tried before the election. And it also happens to be the weakest of them all, which I think ultimately will serve to help Trump.
Yeah. And Trump has also recently called for jailing people who protest against the war in Gaza.
And deporting them. He's vowed to deport them. And he said also, he told some donors that this moment reminds him of Germany right before the Holocaust. So yes.
And he said, and you know what happened then? Hitler was elected, or Hitler came into power. Hitler actually wasn't elected. So is Trump putting himself forward as Hitler in that statement?
Yeah.
Well, that'll win over pro-Israel donors for sure. I mean, he's totally controlled by Miriam Adelson, Israeli American, cut out for Israeli intelligence. He's been, he told the Libertarian Party conference here in Washington a week ago that he was going to release Julian Assange, Ross Ulbricht, and pardon Edward Snowden. But Sheldon Adelson, Miriam's late husband, was not only a patron of Mike Pompeo, then CIA director, who announced WikiLeaks to be a hostile non-state intelligence agency. Sheldon Adelson also served as a CIA asset in the operation that Pompeo engineered to outsource the spying on Assange at the Ecuadorian embassy. So you have this figure, his widow, taking total control over Trump Incorporated, or near total control. Do you really think he's going to pardon Julian Assange? I don't think so. And Ross Ulbricht, who founded the Silk Road, was actually tried in the federal district court on Wall Street, specifically because Wall Street was so threatened by blockchain, the technology he used, and by crypto. You think Wall Street is, I mean, Trump is going to be the biggest tool of Wall Street too. You think he's going to let Ross out? I don't believe him. It was nice that he went to that conference though. I mean, that was like the old Trump, and you'll never see a Democrat talking to an independent party or a third party and asking for their vote. So yeah, I don't know. We could go on, but the choices are looking increasingly dismal for November.
And everything just underscores that we don't have an actual democracy. I mean, people looking at this conviction and saying, look, the system works, the powerful are held to account. I draw the exact opposite lesson. The powerful are held to account only if they happen inconvenienced and threaten other segments of the powerful. And in the case of Trump, there are enough people in Washington and elite circles who don't deem him to be a suitable steward of the U.S. empire, the U.S. war machine. So therefore, he has to be undermined because he's, sometimes he says the truth. He blurts out the truth, like we kill people. And he talks occasionally about cooperating with people we're not supposed to cooperate with, like Russia or North Korea. So therefore, he's too much of an aberration. He can't be controlled. So therefore, he has to be undermined, not at the ballot box, but via all these judicial and really really cynical ways of using the judicial system to undermine him rather than just running against him. And that's been apparent ever since he ran, when they first began this by framing him as a Russian agent. And like, just putting aside Trump's actual politics, which I loathe, if you're a Trump voter, you have grounds to feel as if everything is rigged against you, because they have been trying to undermine him from the start with unfair means. First, by framing him as a Russian agent. That was ridiculous. That was an insane conspiracy theory that engulfed the country for many years. And that was designed to basically, if not kick him out of office, at least constrain him while he was in power. And it was largely successful. And there were and all these other means since. And so it's like, and meanwhile, anybody who commits any actual crimes, including Trump's actual crimes, no, there's never any accountability for that. So, and meanwhile, the real control of our democracy is seen in the donors like Miriam Adelson serving the interests of the Israeli government. That's really how things work. And as you pointed out, Max, like Biden would never be convicted for enabling a genocide. And the moment Trump starts, like if Trump is elected again and he starts going back to serving Israel and all the usual things that presidents do, nobody will care anymore or talk about Stormy Daniels, because all that will be in the past, and he'll be back to doing what presidents are supposed to do, which is enabling mass murder.
Absolutely. Couldn't have said it better. I think we can move on now. I think we've said what needs to be said. I actually, I guess the final thing, I interviewed Stormy Daniels years ago, like before she was known at all. And she, I never thought she would be at the center of something major. But I was passing through Phoenix, and she was declaring that she was going to run against David Vitter, this right-wing Louisiana senator, and I thought it was funny. And I landed an interview with her at a hotel in Phoenix near where she was like stripping near some strip club. And I just thought it'd be funny. I was working for the Daily Beast at the time. It was 2007. And it was wild. It was like a wild interview because of not what took place on camera, but what on camera, she told me she didn't really know why she was running. And a bunch of guys put her up to it to embarrass this Republican, which suggested maybe she was being like used at the time already. She was a political activist, though. She said she donated money to Planned Parenthood. She was very articulate. But she wasn't really, just being around someone from that world was really disturbing. And she repeatedly offered to expose herself during the interview for reasons that I just don't understand. And yeah, she was with her male partner, who was just a really seedy character. And just to think that someone like this is being, I mean, I'm not denigrating sex workers or anything, or people who engage in that line of work, but the idea that she's being upheld as some kind of hero of democracy, especially by someone like E. Jean Carroll, who's the woman who alleged got some crazy payout, like hundreds of millions of dollars from Trump, alleging he sexually harassed her. It really speaks to how decayed this country is, and just the deep decline of the imperial state. That this is like the trial of the century. This is what a president gets convicted for. This is the person. This is the protagonist for the president's opponents. It isn't like some brave whistleblower, some Erin Brockovich type character, or someone who was just like tortured in an illegal, in an illegal CIA snatch and grab operation under orders by the president. It wasn't that. There's just nothing noble there on any side. And I just can't believe that it's all about Stormy Daniels. And meanwhile, the United States, the Biden administration is deeply, deeply involved in genocide. And you're not seeing it covered. All that was talked about today on the Sunday shows was the Trump conviction. So Gaza is kind of off the radar, which is, I guess, good for the Biden administration. And, Trump is not really on message either. But we haven't been able to cover it yet. Horrific massacre took place in Rafah, among many horrific massacres. And I mean, just in the last 36 hours, Israel has killed over 100 people across the Gaza Strip. The brutality is particularly pronounced in the north around Jabalia, but also in Rafah. We saw about, 5 days ago, the tents massacre. This was sort of undeniable that Israel carried out this massacre, bombing an area in the Al-Mawasi refugee camp west of Rafah, where people were told to go as a safe zone. And then they were just indiscriminately bombed in a targeted fashion. Their tents caught on fire. People were burned alive. A child was beheaded. And you can, there's video where you can see that. We're not going to show the video. For some reason, Biden hasn't seen that video, but he saw a video of non-existent beheaded babies on October 7th. The State Department won't admit that any babies have been beheaded by Israel when it's all on camera. And another thing that they won't acknowledge is that the munitions that were used were supplied. These baby buster bombs were supplied by the Blinken State Department through a license for GBU 38 small diameter bombs, thousands of which have been shipped to Israel since 2001. This is CNN of all places. U.S. made munitions used in deadly strike on Rafah tent camp, CNN analysis shows. And the analysis just picks up on open sources, which is, photographs taken and video taken by local Palestinians and Palestinian journalists after the tent massacre, showing the shells of the bombs. I can tell you, having been present in Rafah after the Black Friday massacre on August 1st, 2014, I walked through Rafah and found U.S.-made munitions that literally said "Made in the USA" everywhere. But those were 500-pound bombs. These are smaller 250-pound bombs. And Tony Blinken was asked about these bombs, was asked about whether there was a U.S. role at all in this attack. And here's his response.
Very clear with Israel on the imperative in this instance, as in other instances, to immediately investigate and determine exactly what happened and why it happened. And if accountability is necessary, to make sure that there is accountability. I can't tell you as we meet here this evening what weapons were used or how they were used. All of that needs to be the product of a deliberate but also fast investigation, and we'll await the results. Been very clear with Israel on the imperative.
So, let Israel, it's another let Israel investigate itself, and we don't know what happened there when it's pretty well documented.
On top of how ridiculous it is to let Israel investigate itself, you have the fact that what Israel's putting out outright disinformation, staged audio of what it claims are intercepted conversations of people inside Gaza, where basically they happen to admit to everything Israeli talking points, Israeli propaganda claims. So Israel put out this tape that they said was of 2 people in Gaza. They've done this before too, after the bombing of the Al-Adi hospital months ago. And on the call, these 2 people say, yes, the Israelis launched a very precision strike, left a very small crater. And what happened was it hit our weapons. So it hit Hamas bombs. And also we had money lying around. There was Hamas money lying around. They threw that in for fun. Why not? And it's such an obvious scam, a fabrication, basically scripted content. That's what Israel's putting out. So that's the government that Blinken says we have to rely on to investigate itself. Not only a government that will investigate itself and clear itself, but that is literally putting out staged propaganda to whitewash its own crimes. And Blinken wants to take that seriously and wants to pretend as if he doesn't know that U.S. munitions were used in that, when even CNN had to acknowledge that they were.
In December, was it December or November? Israel dropped a 2,000-pound bomb on the Maghazi refugee camp, killing over 80 civilians. There was no military target there at all. And when it was established weeks later that there was no military target at all, Israel declared, after stating that they had eliminated a top Hamas figure, they claimed that they had committed some terrible mistake. And the same thing happened after the Flower massacre in the north, when people were gunned down with tank fire, waiting for aid in northern Gaza, where aid was being blocked. They claimed that it was their fault and they were shot by Hamas police before Israel admitted it, then said it was a mistake, or they lied about it. They lied about the Al-Ahli Baptist Hospital massacre, blamed Palestinian Islamic Jihad rocket misfire. And now they lied again. They first said that they had eliminated a top Hamas operative. It's like a playbook. Then they said that it was a terrible mistake when it was clear that there was no military target there. And they were just massacring civilians the same way they massacred World Central Kitchen workers. And I think there was some deception that was deployed there as well. That they had armed men. Israel claimed that armed men had entered the World Central Kitchen convoy from a warehouse, and they targeted them on that basis. In reality, a settler, a religious nationalist fanatic settler, pushed the button, authorized the strike on the World Central Kitchen workers. And we can just assume the same. We can assume that this Rafah massacre took place because Israel wanted to clear Rafah of refugees so it could deepen its invasion of the city, because the invasion's ongoing. There are tanks in the center of Rafah, and the Biden administration said, well, we agreed that Israel could have this limited invasion because so many refugees in Rafah have fled north. And so we think that the civilian casualty toll will be lower. And now Israel's in the center. It was obvious to me that this was a message to refugees. It was deliberate. And they beheaded children on purpose, along with burning people alive with a U.S. supplied weapon. And just one more point, since I'm kind of going off here. Remember, this was a so-called small diameter bomb, GBU 68, not like a 38, not like a GBU 82, which are the 2,000-pound bombs the U.S. has supplied, the baby buster bombs. This was propaganda deployed by the Biden administration in early December. U.S. officials outlined steps to Israel to reduce civilian casualties. We're only going to kill less babies now. The measures include using smaller bombs against Hamas, U.S. officials said. Smaller bombs. Well, here's the smaller bombs. They caused one of the most notorious massacres possible, and you advised them to do it. That was your solution. Instead of, I don't know, not sending the bombs, you could have just stopped sending the bombs and then had a ceasefire, the hostages would be freed. Tens of thousands of people would still be alive, but this isn't an administration that will actually act in the interest of human life. Just look at what they're doing to extend the Ukraine proxy war.
Yeah. So like this is the tangible result of Biden's so-called pause of that U.S. shipment that included 2,000-pound bombs. You send over these bombs, these so-called smaller bombs, that still massacre people. So tangibly, zero difference whatsoever. And ultimately, that pause was also meaningless because Israel already had all the weapons it needed to attack Rafah anyway, as we just saw with this massacre. But yet, they still won't say that the red line has been crossed. Even though Jake Sullivan said that the metric, he said there's no mathematical formula, but what we'll look to see when it comes to judging Israel's conduct in Rafah is if there's death and destruction. Well, Israel's been causing nothing but death and destruction. But of course, nothing has changed because Biden's red line doesn't exist. It was just another scam.
He doesn't have a red line. He hasn't had a red line. He has a bottom line. The bottom line is getting money from donors like Haim Saban, pro-Israel donors that comprise at least a plurality of donors to the Biden campaign and the Biden Victory Fund. But now Biden, as a direct result, I mean, it's obviously tied in to the hideous scenes that have poured out of Rafah. Biden has called for a ceasefire for the first time. And it's been a very bizarre episode. I'm still trying to unpack it myself. I want to know what you think, Aaron. But here's Biden tweeting, "This is a decisive moment. Israel has made their proposal. Hamas says it wants a ceasefire. This deal is an opportunity to prove they mean it. Hamas needs to take the deal," Biden said. This is all part of a speech Biden delivered. This is like a summary of the speech. Here's Blinken. "We have a chance to end the war in Gaza, bring the hostages home, and alleviate the suffering of the Palestinian people with this ceasefire deal that's on the table. I spoke with several of my counterparts in the region today to stress that Hamas should accept the deal." Oh, here's Annalena Baerbock, who is sort of the junior partner in genocide as Germany's foreign secretary. "We fully support the mediation efforts of the USA, Qatar, and Egypt. It is now up to Hamas to prove their commitment to ending the conflict." So Germany's on board. Who isn't on board? Oh, David Cameron's on board. Hamas must accept it. But guess who didn't accept it? Israel. Hamas said they viewed the deal favorably, just as they had, I think 3 weeks ago, accepted a ceasefire proposal. And once again, Israel has rejected it. So why didn't Biden kind of clear this with Israel? And what was the purpose of his ceasefire call except to kind of save his own skin because his poll numbers are sagging, his approval ratings below 40. He may not even be able to make it to Chicago. It looks like the Democrats are going to nominate him remotely. Here's Netanyahu, just throwing Biden under the bus. This tiny little foreign apartheid state with like less than 6 million people in it. The notion that Israel will agree to a permanent ceasefire before these conditions are fulfilled, the total defeat of Hamas, is a non-starter. That's after Biden's announcement. So I'm just kind of confused. Did Israel just like pull like did they just dupe Biden into making that statement, or did Biden make it without consulting with the Israeli prime minister? Was it, the Mossad has been doing the negotiating in Doha. So did they just speak to the Mossad about this and there's space between them and the prime minister's office? Either way, you have the US, like Israel, just completely shafting Biden right now, and Biden doing nothing to retaliate or to hold them accountable. And I mean, so it's up to Hamas to get this ceasefire done. When are they going to say it's up to Israel to agree to the terms?
Yeah, I know from Haaretz that right before the speech, the Biden administration notified Yoav Gallant and Benny Gantz, who are in Netanyahu's cabinet, and I guess are seen by the U.S. as more malleable to as more willing to cooperate with Biden's goals. So I think they were trying to get their allies in the cabinet of Israel on board. But I think ultimately, it's what you said. Biden knows that this issue is threatening his reelection chances. So he needs to finally pretend to be for a ceasefire. So he put it out there. And he also pretended as if it was Israel's proposal, even though, as you noted, Israel immediately rejected it. And then now he can say, well, I tried, but Israel has its security needs and there's only so much we can do. But just so everyone knows, I did come out for a permanent ceasefire, of course, 7 months into the genocide. I think that's pretty much what they thought they would do, recognizing that Netanyahu is never going to agree to a permanent ceasefire anyway, at least before Biden's reelection, because Israeli officials have talked about this war is going to go on, this massacre, this genocide will go on until the end of the year. So recognizing that Netanyahu is not going to stop anyway, I think Biden finally decided to pretend as if he was for a ceasefire.
Yeah, and talk about mixed messaging. The State Department's been consistently saying that Hamas has to be completely defeated. They've been calling for regime change, echoing Israel. And now Biden says, well, another October 7th won't happen, so Israel's achieved its goal. Take the win. Essentially accepting that Hamas will not be defeated. Hamas cannot be defeated because it isn't like, Nicolae Ceausescu. It isn't one man ruling over a people. It has a mass constituency. It has a resistance faction that is fighting and causing losses to Israeli soldiers as we speak. Guys wearing sandals fighting one of the most technologically advanced militaries in human history. And they just can't do it. So Biden is kind of thrown in the towel. If we go back a few months, like maybe to early January, February, earlier this year, the Biden administration's language was all about the day after. They actually thought that Israel would have a swift defeat of Hamas, and then this rebuilding process would come in and they would do counterinsurgency like they did in the West Bank, where they bring in mercenary firms to train a bunch of Vichy-style lackeys like the Palestinian Authority. And then that's the end of it. They're not talking about the day after now. And I think they're starting to realize that what Israel's plan isn't to prevent another October 7th, although that is like one of the more charitable assessments from a military standpoint of what Israel's doing, considering that they have failed in their stated objectives to release the so-called hostages, many of whom are prisoners of war, to release them with military means and to defeat Hamas. So I don't know. I think reading this situation, this is twice that Israel has flouted the Biden administration. Biden has retaliated by doing nothing. He mentioned a pause, but have we seen any real pause in weaponry to Israel that prevents it from carrying out these kind of operations? I don't think so. What was Nikki Haley signing? And so, as the National Security Council director of Israel, Jake Sullivan's counterpart, close Netanyahu confidant Zaki Hanegbi, has said this war will last through the year. That's Israel's plan. Kill 100 people a day for the rest of the year. How's that going to work out for Biden? Will that bode well for the Democratic convention? So I don't know what to say anymore. They're not the Biden administration could easily engineer a ceasefire, and it's just trying to cover its own ass. Here we go. Look at this. This is just like initial reporting. DNC plans to hold virtual roll call to nominate Biden before convention. The Democratic Party is planning to hold a virtual roll call ahead of the party's August convention to nominate him. They're already talking about going virtual, but what I'm hearing out of Chicago is the cops aren't ready for mass protests. They're freaking out. The Chicago local authorities are freaking out, and the Democrats are talking about at least doing a hybrid convention where part of it is virtual because of the protests, the anger against Biden, the possibility of disruptions throughout the convention. And it's Biden's fault. It's completely Biden's fault. But here's a president who came in as someone who believed in the special relationship with Israel. This is what you get with Israel as your ally. This is what they do to you. And we, the US taxpayer, we spend our money subsidizing a country that spies on us, that infiltrates our politics, that manipulates politics down to the city council and college student elected body level, that tries to get that orchestrates mob riots to beat peaceful US protesters, as we saw at UCLA, where the infrastructure was provided by the Israel American Council of Miriam Adelson. All Israeli donors, or all Israeli American donors paying for that, along with Jerry Seinfeld's wife and Bill Ackman. And it's a country that openly defies its sponsor, its sugar daddy. And for some reason, our sugar daddy can't do it. The sugar daddy can't do anything. He can't cut off the financial feeding tube. He can't say no.
Israel also literally kills American citizens and never gets punished for it. I mean, the list includes Rachel Corrie, Shireen Abu Akleh. I'm sure there have been U.S. citizens that have been killed in the Gaza mass murder campaign too, and there's never any punishment for it. Netanyahu openly called for the censorship of protesters protesting his genocide recently.
He called for the military to crack. He called for a National Guard, Kent-style repression of U.S. protesters. And, I was in the State Department briefing room the next day just because I couldn't resist. And everyone was asking him, Saeed Erekat leading the charge, will you condemn Netanyahu for calling for the U.S. National Guard to crack down on Americans peacefully protesting? And they couldn't do it. I mean, you got Eric Clapton, of all people, declaring that Israel controls the world. I don't think Israel controls the world, but you can forgive people for thinking that when you look at the most powerful country in human history, the most powerful empire in human history, getting pushed around by a tiny little apartheid state 5,000 miles away.
Yeah.
What the hell is going on here? So, I mean, based on what I'm seeing, it looks like the war will continue indefinitely. It's an endless war. And people are starving again in Gaza. I don't know if there's anything you want to add on the subject of the ceasefire, but Biden, in his speech, falsely claimed that the U.S. is supporting humanitarian supplies to Gaza.
On which people in this country feel deep, passionate convictions. And so do I. This has been one of the hardest, most complicated problems in the world. There's nothing easy about this. Nothing easy about it. Through it all, though, the United States has worked relentlessly to support Israeli security, to get humanitarian supplies into Gaza, to get a ceasefire and a hostage deal to bring this war to an end. I know this.
It's actually the most simple problem in the world. It's a ethno-supremacist apartheid state waging the longest running military occupation in the world, and does so with U.S. support. It's a really easy problem to solve. Just stop supporting this insane state and its military occupation, which Israel is defending by wiping out Gaza. That's the aim of this operation in Gaza, is not to defeat Hamas. It's to basically destroy Gaza so that it's unlivable, because Israel wants to control whatever Palestinian land it wants and wants to crush anyone who dares resist it. That's a pretty easy problem to solve. So when he pretends, and people go along with this is a liberal talking point too. Oh, it's really complicated. This is an intractable conflict that's going on centuries. It's has to do with religious resentment. It's all hogwash. It's really the simplest problem in the world.
No, not sending spare parts for Israel's F-15s and F-35s it would bring them to their knees.
Yeah.
They would lose fire support and they would come to the table. They're not going to do that. Biden's not going to do that. But he's lying there about humanitarian aid. He's straight up lying. That's the other thing, is the Biden strategy for Gaza was sick from the beginning, but it was to give Israel as much weapons as it could with one hand and give people in Gaza a bunch of as much flour as it could get in to bake bread and survive for as long as they could until their house was brought down on their heads by those U.S. weapons. But the U.S. isn't even doing that because it's forced to stand up to Israel to get the aid in. That's why they built that pathetic aid port off the coast of Gaza, which is now floating around in the sea at a cost of over $300 million to U.S. taxpayers. We called it out at the time. We said it was going to be a gigantic disaster. I actually thought it was going to be worse, that it would actually work and U.S. Citizens and army personnel and mercenaries would get killed in Gaza. But the whole pier just washed up on the shore. And they did it specifically because they needed some PR cover for the fact that they couldn't twist Israel's arms slightly to get the aid in to at least fulfill the disgusting strategy that they laid out after October 7th. And here is Biden lying again and triggering actually one resignation that I think is kind of significant.
Yeah, there's been a few. Stacey Gilbert recently resigned from USAID after basically the USA took part in a State Department report that falsified Israel's record of blocking aid. Blinken oversaw this report that just basically said that Israel is not denying Gaza humanitarian aid, which is just one of the most monstrous lies that have been told in U.S. government history, up there with Iraq WMDs. And so Stacey Gilbert quit because this was such an obvious falsification of the reality. And she also pointed out that experts who weighed in on this were sidelined, and people from above, who she didn't name, were basically writing new conclusions that were not supported by all the available data. Sounds a lot like, by the way, like the OPCW cover-up. The actual experts get sidelined. People at the top fix the conclusions to justify a political narrative. And in this case, this means justifying Israel's deliberate starvation policy of Gaza, which is causing literal famine.
So why I think Stacey Gilbert's resignation was significant was she actually exposed Blinken for just lying, as he said, that they falsified a report absolving Israel on Gaza aid. State Department, and screw the Guardian, but here's a summary. The State Department falsified a report earlier this month to absolve Israel of responsibility for blocking humanitarian aid flows into Gaza, overruling the advice of its own experts, according to a former senior U.S. official who resigned this week. And she was in the State Department. This is sort of consistent with what we've seen at USAID, where Samantha Power, who's supposed to be sort of the guru of responsibility to protect humanitarian intervention, complains on Twitter that not enough aid is getting into Gaza, but does nothing of substance or anything like what Stacey Gilbert did, which is to resign in order to expose the issue. And her own staffers have confronted her at USAID on her complete fealty to Biden, who himself is behaving like Bibi's lapdog. So you have the whole aid industry, U.S. diplomacy exposed, not only for doing Israel's bidding, but for lying on Israel's behalf, cooking reports. Not just that report, but there was also the report of the State Department lawyers arguing or assessing that Israel had not committed war crimes with U.S. weapons. I mean, how can that be? How can that just not be laughed at? And announcing that through their spokesman at the State Department briefing. I mean, this is like it's the same thing the Bush neocons did in civilian positions in the Pentagon on Iraq WMD. But they're just lying to the public about what Israel's doing. And you can see it before your very eyes through our reporting at the Grayzone, where Jeremy Lafredo, our contributor went to the Kerem Shalom crossing between Gaza and what is considered Israel, and showed that the army and police were handing out watermelon and bottled water to fanatical settlers who were preventing aid from going in and actually attacking Egyptian aid trucks and taunting Egyptian soldiers. I mean, it's all on video, and the State Department's just lying. So what? Yeah.
Let's listen to a bit of what Stacey Gilbert said, because it's important.
The genesis of my move was actually a result of a joint report that the Department of State and the Department of Defense had to submit in response to a request from the White House. And that report was supposed to assess various countries on two things: their ability to adhere to international humanitarian law, also known as the Geneva Conventions or the law of war, and whether they facilitate and not obstruct humanitarian assistance. Israel was one of the countries. The other countries we were assessing, there was some debate, some discussion about, but not nearly on the level that we debated and discussed these issues regarding Israel. The subject matter experts are absolutely in agreement that Israel is blocking humanitarian assistance. There is no doubt about that. I was very involved in writing the report up to a certain level, but at some point, the subject matter experts were removed from the report. It was moved up to a higher level, and I myself didn't see it until it was released on May 10th. When it was released on May 10th, I was actually on the point of Israel's adherence to international humanitarian law. I was surprised because the report concluded, as far as I know, the first time the U.S. has admitted that Israel is probably using U.S. weapons to violate international humanitarian law. But I was shocked.
Just a correction. The report did say that, but then it said there's insufficient information to come to a conclusion. So it was typical Antony Blinken. It was very mealy-mouthed. They said, yes, there are reasonable grounds or something to believe as if Israel might be violating international law with their weapons, but there's insufficient information, so therefore we can't reach a conclusion. That was actually what the report found.
I mean, one way. Yeah, go ahead.
No.
Well, one way of investigating would be to strap neocons to the bombs they sign, and then maybe they can report from the ground in Gaza. I don't know.
Humanitarian law. But I was shocked to see that it stated very clearly that we assess that Israel is not blocking humanitarian assistance. That is patently false. That is not the opinion. It's not just not the opinion. There is data that is showing that Israel is blocking humanitarian assistance.
And it's really significant that someone is speaking out about this from the inside and has resigned over it. I mean, of course, one could argue all these resignations should have happened much earlier, but better late than never. And yeah, she's exposing Antony Blinken here because this is Antony Blinken's report ultimately. He's responsible for it. It was his State Department that put it out. And yeah, reading the report, it was obvious. It was totally incoherent. They acknowledge that Israel is basically blocking aid and violating the law, but yet they come to the conclusion that it's not ultimately. It's just completely incoherent and mealy-mouthed, which is who Antony Blinken is.
And, I mean, one of the worst secretaries of state, if not... I mean, Condi Rice, Colin Powell, they at least conveyed some sort of gravitas as they lied the U.S. into wars and doomed the lives of people across the Middle East to ashes, ruin, and bloodshed. Tony Blinken, I mean, he's not even selling this very well. It's just ridiculous.
Let me show Samantha Power, who also, I mean, her job is supposed to be as a humanitarian official, even though, of course, the head of USAID is the opposite of that, really. That's what her job is supposed to be. So she's had to pretend for months now as if she's responding to the Gaza crisis rather than facilitating the starvation, which is really what the Biden administration is doing. And so she's had this term she used. She says, we have to surge aid to Gaza. But the problem is she keeps promising this, and it never happens. So here she is on May 30th. Today, I convene fellow donor governments to surge our response to those in dire need. But the problem is, you go back months, and she's been saying this ever since October. So this is earlier this month. Humanitarian conditions in Gaza continue to worsen. We must use all avenues to surge aid to civilians. Okay, so that is mid-May. Then you have, this is now April. We continue to press for greater protections for civilians and to surge vital aid into Gaza. Okay, that's April. Now let's go back to February. Met today with Palestinian Authority President Abbas. We spoke about the need to surge humanitarian assistance to civilians in Gaza. And then finally back in November, I spoke to Caitlin Collins of CNN about the work the U.S. is doing, along with our partners, to surge life-saving assistance to civilians in Gaza. How can you say you're surging aid to Gaza if you keep promising to do it over a 7-month span? It never actually happens. It's just a stupid talking point she's using. So imagine, like, not only being an administration that's complicit in this mass murder, being someone whose job it is to pretend as if you're actually addressing it, which is Samantha Power's job. It's the height of cynicism.
Well, what was the vehicle for surging it? Again, it was this pier. There's the pier for surging the aid. It washed up in Ashdod, in the Israeli city of Ashdod. It's in pieces. And no aid ever arrived to anyone in Gaza through that pier. Nothing. If anything, it was stolen. Why was it stolen? Because Hamas police cannot, the actual government of Gaza, the police are not allowed to operate openly because they'll all be killed by Israel, which the U.S. allows them and authorizes them and supports them to do. I mean, this is the biggest, it's a fiasco on top of a humanitarian catastrophe, and it's Samantha Power's fault. And no one's asking her to resign from within the administration for that failure because it's actually a success. She's just providing cover for genocide. And, you know, providing cover, when I say providing cover, she helped cover up the killing by Israel of a contractor for USAID under her own watch, which when it came out infuriated USAID staff, but we're seeing very few resignations over there. I mean, this is like a world-class fiasco. And if Donald Trump was responsible for it, it would be the laughingstock of the media. There'd be so much righteous indignation from MSNBC and CNN and Congress, and hardly anyone saying anything, although we've seen a few Republican senators like Roger Wicker complain about the price tag and the waste of the aid pier. I thought it was going to be actually used to like help ethnically cleanse Gaza, to get refugees out and then dump them all on Europe and say, hey, Europe, here's another refugee crisis we created after Syria, and, suck it up, Germany. We're transatlantic, but they didn't even get to that point. So there was no surge. Yeah, I don't know if you want to add anything there, but I thought maybe we could move on to Ukraine.
Yeah. I wanted to just show one more headline before we get to Ukraine away from Gaza. This is something that appeared in the New York Times the other day about violence.
Oh, man, I saw this today.
So according to the New York Times, Palestinian land is now, quote, land long used by Palestinians. They can't even say Palestinian land anymore. They're so dehumanized that their land doesn't even belong to them. Basically, they use the land until a supremacist ethno-state comes along claiming a biblically endowed right to steal their land, and therefore they get to take it from them. And really, it never was theirs because they were just using it. That's the message we're getting from the New York Times. I mean, this is just like, the fanaticism is off the charts. Imagine who had to come up with that. Like, I imagine someone probably wrote Palestinian land, and maybe an editor came in and said, no, sorry, we can't call it Palestinian land anymore. Let's think of a different term. And they came up with land long used by Palestinians.
How do you seize something that isn't owned or rightfully possessed by someone. It says seizures of land long used, so they're contradicting themselves. As an editor, one of the most important things in journalism, particularly in writing headlines and subheads, the teaser, is word economy. But they're extending the sentence to unusual lengths in order to avoid irritating the Israel lobby, and therefore negating not just the Palestinian ownership of this land. A lot of this land is privately owned by Palestinians, like Palestinian shepherds, people who are, own olive groves. I know them who've had their land stolen by settlers. But also under international law, under Resolution 242, the West Bank, all of it is Palestinian. So the New York Times is contravening international law here. I guess this is the rules-based unusual word order. I don't know. This is the paper that constantly says violence rocks Gaza whenever Israel commits a massacre. Violence grows. It's like Gaza rocked by violence. Everything's the passive voice. Yeah. It's like they're talking about like a Jerry Springer episode where people are just feuding and violence suddenly rocks the set. There should, the New York Times has been just absolutely atrocious, even worse than the Washington Post. Yeah. And in an insidious way.
Yeah. But they still gave themselves the Pulitzer Prize for their coverage of Gaza. The New York Times did. So congratulations to them.
Yeah. They proved that mass sexual assault happened on October 7th before they even obtained the evidence. It was a remarkable journalistic feat. And since then, the evidence hasn't arrived, and only 1 out of 3 reporters responsible for that article has been fired. But they gave themselves the Pulitzer Prize. I think getting the Pulitzer Prize, it's like getting the Nobel Prize. It's like a scarlet letter. It should be like a badge of shame at this point.
Yep.
So Politico reports that Biden has secretly given Ukraine permission to strike inside Russia with U.S. weapons. This is sort of something that Tony Blinken has been lobbying for some time, along with U.S. senators who are neocon hawks from both parties who have very close relationships with the Pentagon and the military industry that's making a literal killing off this war. The Pentagon sent its people down to the House Armed Services Committee to lobby members on striking inside Russia with U.S. weapons like the ATACMS missiles made by, I believe, Lockheed Martin. And the Politico reported that those members were actually confused and a little bit upset because they don't understand how this will improve the outcome for Ukraine in a war that they're clearly losing, where they're getting routed. And today, I don't have it in front of me. The Washington Post has a headline, while the U.S. debated, Russia rampaged in Kharkiv. Basically, like, we're not allowed to debate, and attacking members of Congress for asking how these weapons are going to be used. And, asking any questions of the Pentagon. How dare you ask the Pentagon or Zelensky any questions? Just give them the money, give them the weapons, escalate, or we'll lose Kharkiv. So, Aaron, what are your thoughts? What's going to happen next?
Well, let's recall that for all this talk about, Russia's red lines in the war, it's actually Biden that has had pretty clear red lines. He initially said, there's no way we're giving long-range missiles like ATACMS to Ukraine because that could risk war with Russia. Well, then he crossed that red line and gave the ATACMS because Ukraine has suffered losses. He said the same thing about cluster munitions. We're not giving them cluster munitions. And he crossed the red line and he gave them cluster munitions. And so now, giving Ukraine permission to strike inside Russia is the latest step up the escalation ladder, where Biden does something that he's previously ruled out. So now he says, okay, fine, we're going to give Ukraine permission to use our weapons to strike inside Russia. And to do that, by the way, that means U.S. officials will basically be taking part, because it's now widely known that when Ukraine hits high value targets, the US takes part. They select the targets, they help operate the weapon systems. That was confirmed in that leaked German audio call from a few weeks ago when a bunch of senior German military officials were talking about sending their own long range missiles into Ukraine. And they said that there are Americans on the ground helping operate their weapon systems there. So it's very plausible to assume that this will be the same case here. So Biden now says, okay, fine, we're going to give them this assistance and this authorization to use our weapons to strike inside of Russia, but it's only going to happen in the Kharkiv region where Ukraine has been taking heavy losses. So it'll only be across the border into Kharkiv. But already Anthony Blinken has said, when asked about whether it will expand to other places, he said, well, we always adapt and adjust. And he said the same thing when asked last week about the policy of not allowing Ukraine strike inside Russia with U.S. weapons at all. So it's very plausible to assume that Biden's supposed, narrow guideline that you can only strike across the border from Kharkiv, that will eventually be expanded, because every time Biden said they can't do something, he's crossed his own red line. And so where is this going? Like, where is this headed to? And why? Why are we risking the insanity of direct confrontation between the world's top two nuclear powers, especially at a time, by the way, when Ukraine's been hitting Russian nuclear warning sites, not with U.S. weapons, thankfully, but they've been using drones to hit Russian radar sites that have nothing to do with Russia's war in Ukraine, but have to do with Russia's ability to detect incoming ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons. And for fair reasons, Russia, I think, assumes that basically Ukrainian strikes are coordinated with the U.S. because there's so much of that. So how do they know if the U.S. says, well, okay, we have nothing to do with Ukraine striking your radar sites? I mean, hopefully that's true, but I can't expect Russia to assume that at this point. So now we're at a point where Ukraine is hitting nuclear warning sites, which at a time when now the U.S. is giving Ukraine permission to use U.S. weapons inside of Russia. And so we're just playing with the most dangerous game I think the world has ever seen. And why? For what? Because we don't want to negotiate with Russia over who gets to rule Crimea, where most of the people there, whether the U.S. likes it or not, favor joining Russia, or the Donbass, where at least there's a sizable number of people who want to be a part of Russia. I don't know the exact numbers, but at least there's a significant number of the population. So we're going to risk nuclear confrontation and the continued sacrifice of all these Ukrainian and Russian lives over all of this, especially when there was almost a deal reached between these two sides 2 years ago in April 2022, when they came very close to a deal in Istanbul before Ukraine walked away, likely under U.S. British pressure. So this is just insane. And, somebody listening to this might argue, well, why can't Ukraine hit inside Russia? They're being attacked by Russia. And in theory, I think that's true. But the question is, if there are reasonable alternatives to this war, and there's an outcome that's already been on the table, the Minsk II Accords, which Ukraine refused to implement, followed by the peace deal that Ukraine almost reached but then walked away from, why not go back to that rather than play with terminal nuclear war?
And as we've seen, Russia can always out-escalate. Russia can always go a step higher on the escalation ladder. As we've seen, when Ukraine gets authorization to hit inside Russia, or when it thinks it has it, or when it just does it, it's usually some kind of terror attack. An attack on the Kerch Bridge, which the U.S. has tried to walk away from, attacks on Russian journalists, the killing of Daria Dugina, attacks on a Christmas festival inside Russia, which killed civilians. They're not exactly changing the calculus of the war or forcing Russia to think twice about moving forward towards Kharkiv. And by the way, I would be surprised if Russia takes over Kharkiv. But that would just, it's sort of like the propaganda we saw about Kiev, that they were actually going to try to take that whole city over. But that's beside the point. There's nothing that this will accomplish except extending the war and causing more escalation that will cause more death and destruction, primarily to Ukraine. And this is of, I think, great interest to people in the Biden administration. I'm behind a subscription wall on the Wall Street Journal, but there was a piece right when the supplemental was being debated on $95 million to Israel and Ukraine, about how profitable this would be to the American economy itself. And the piece concludes I can actually pull up this screenshot quickly, but it concludes that the Biden administration will be able to reap electoral benefits from that military aid as it comes back to swing states like Arizona and Pennsylvania. Here's the Wall Street Journal. British defense contractor BAE Systems plans to create 500 jobs by expanding facilities in Minnesota. Minnesota is a big swing state, while General Dynamics will create around 120 positions at a new plant in Texas. Biden officials say funding allocated for Ukraine is rebuilding America's defense industrial base, jumpstarting and expanding production lines for weapons and ammo, and supporting jobs in 40 states. The administration might also hope for political benefits by noting the impact on employers in electoral swing states such as Pennsylvania and Arizona, each of which will receive more than $2 billion, according to the Department of Defense. This is the necro economy. And Biden is hoping that by extending the Ukraine war, voters will reward him in states that depend on the defense industry. That's pretty sick.
It's so sick. And the neocon mindset in Washington is so powerful that Republicans, even though the Biden administration openly admits, as you pointed out there in the Wall Street Journal, openly admits that this money will benefit Democrats in the election, Republicans still give them the money because overall it's hegemony that drives everything above even like partisan interests in this case. So even like you didn't care about like nuclear war, about tens of thousands of Ukrainians dying on America, for the interest of the U.S. Just as a Republican, from like a partisan point of view, it wouldn't be in your interest. But yet they don't care because it's all about hegemony. That is the overriding thing. And your point about putting aside everything about the alternatives to war, like diplomacy and the long-term well-being of Ukraine, what you talked about, how this every time the U.S. escalates in Ukraine, it only hurts Ukraine because Russia can always escalate more. Someone who put this very succinctly is Antony Blinken, who's now overseeing the exact opposite policy. But this is him back in 2015.
In a sense, if you're playing on a military terrain in Ukraine, you're playing to Russia's strength, because Russia's right next door. It has a huge amount of military equipment and military force right on the border. Anything we did as countries in terms of military support for Ukraine is likely to be matched and then doubled and tripled and quadrupled by Russia. It has the ability to do that. It would be very difficult for us to do that. And then you may well get into an escalatory cycle that is hard to control and hard to predict.
You think, Antony Blinken, you might get into an escalatory cycle that's hard to control? Well, that's exactly what he is doing now. And in fact, he's the person who led the push inside the White House to approve the use of U.S. weapons to strike inside of Russia. So he's now pushing the policy he argued against back in 2015. The difference is the policy he's now pushing is far more dangerous than what he argued against back in 2015, because back then he was talking about supplying Ukraine as it battles Ukrainian rebels in the eastern Donbass who were backed by Russia. Now he's talking about supplying Ukraine as it battles Russia directly. Back in 2015, it was a proxy war with U.S.-backed Ukrainian government fighting the Russian-backed Eastern Ukrainian rebels. Now it's full-on war, and it's cross-border now too. And so he's pushing not only a policy that is the exact opposite of what he wanted back in 2015, but is now it's far more dangerous than what he even warned about then. So that's who he is now, and that's who the Biden administration is.
Yeah, I think the greatest threat that human civilization faces comes from this. Especially with the accession of Finland and Sweden to NATO. And Sweden also signed some cooperation deal, which basically gives the U.S. total control over their military. I don't know why they need to do that after joining NATO. It's almost like super NATO. And you have the Biden administration escalating with Russia. So the risk of nuclear war just keeps going up. And people just belittle that and minimize it across the West. People talk about climate change being this extinction agenda. They never talk about nuclear war anymore. This should be an election issue, but it's not. There's very little activism anymore on preventing nuclear war. I remember growing up in the 80s, we'd hear about it all the time. There's a giant anti-nuclear rally in New York City in Central Park. That's all gone. And that, creates space for the Blinkens to do what they're doing. And it really is up to Russia, as the US escalates, refuses to authorize and sabotages negotiations. It's up to Russia to always limit its escalation after Ukraine escalates further. This war could be over with a phone call.
Yeah, and again, when did Russia really start going after civilian infrastructure like the energy grid? It was the fall of 2022, after Ukraine hit the Kerch Bridge in Crimea. So they've shown that after Ukraine escalates, Russia will escalate more. There was an article back in September 2022 in the New York Times saying U.S. officials fear that the most dangerous moments are yet to come, because at that point, they said Putin had not escalated the war. And in fact, they were baffled at how little Putin had escalated. So they've gotten their predicted outcome as a consequence of their refusal to allow diplomacy. This is the result. And where does it go next? So now we're on the escalation ladder. Now we're on to allowing strikes with U.S. weapons into Russia. What's next? Because it's gone up repeatedly. So what's next? I mean, it's hard to think about.
Well, that I think is where we should leave it, is what's next, and we'll be covering what's next if we can. But it's not something. I mean, it's something to take really seriously. And I mean, I guess circling back to the beginning of this live stream, I don't see Trump fulfilling his promise to end the Ukraine proxy war after all that's happened in the past several months, and with his felony conviction. I think he could very well continue it and claim that he's sort of powerless, but we'll see. I do want to wrap there, unless you have anything to add.
No.
And several people in the chat have been asking us to address this Washington Post hit piece that came out on the Grayzone, and specifically Wyatt Reed. It's a pretty sleazy hit piece filled with falsehoods, misinformation, innuendo. It's a direct result of us being very effective on dismantling Israeli propaganda. And it's directly about that. It's directly targeting us in a very malicious way, and we're going to address it this week. We're going to dismantle that piece and expose everyone involved with it. But right now, I just wanted to address everything that happened in the past week or so since we last did a live stream. So look for us this week. We'll do it live. We'll address it on the site. And we're being attacked because we're an independent outlet that is giving a headache to Israeli propagandists, U.S. regime propagandists who want these wars. There's no other reason for it. And, they're sending like mainstream media after us. Like Wikipedia says we're like some fringe site. All right, if we're some fringe site, then why can't you? Our Wikipedia entry, which was written by these kinds of spooks or spook adjacent neocons, if we're so fringe, why can't you stop focusing on us and lying about us? So we will address that this week, but that's all for our live stream now. Thanks a lot for supporting us. Subscribe, like the stream. We're always demonetized for whatever reason. So we're algorithmically suppressed. So liking and subscribing really helps us out, and support us in any way you see fit. And thanks a lot for joining us, Aaron.
Thank you, Max. Thanks everyone for being here. We'll see you next time.
All right. Peace, everybody.
Peace.